Under the fierce noonday sun, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction, gold dust and silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth. A lone rider cut across the horizon, his silhouette framed by the shimmer of heat rising off the sand. His name was Colt Mercer, a bounty hunter known from the Dakota Plains to the Mexican border. Men feared his accuracy, women whispered about his cold eyes, and lawmen trusted him more than they trusted their own deputies. But that day, under that wide, unbroken sky, something was about to change, a story that would twist his fate like a spur in the dust. He rode with purpose, his black duster trailing behind him, a wanted poster folded in the pocket near his chest. The edges were frayed, the ink beginning to fade, but the face was still clear enough to haunt him. A woman young, sharp-eyed, and defiant even in stillness. Her name was Evelyn Cross, wanted for robbery and accessory to murder in the town of Coyotes Ridge. The price on her head was higher than most men's lives, and Colt had never let his heart get in the way of money before. But something about her eyes, drawn in charcoal lines, caught him off guard the first time he saw the poster. Maybe it was the way the artist had captured that faint sadness beneath the defiance, or maybe it was something he couldn't name. Whatever it was, it stayed with him through every mile of trail he rode that week. The sun dropped low as Colt reached the edge of the canyon, a narrow pass winding down toward a thin line of green where water cut through rock. He dismounted, crouched low, and examined the trail. Fresh hoofprints, small, light, probably a woman's horse. He could tell she wasn't far. The sand still held the shape of the hooves, crisp and deep. He adjusted his hat, checked his revolver, and led his horse forward into the canyon's shadow. The light shifted from gold to amber, then dimmed into cool blue. The air was still except for the whisper of wind between stone walls. As Colt moved deeper into the pass, he spotted a thin column of smoke curling up from a hidden alcove near the creek. His pulse slowed. It wasn't luck, it was instinct. She was here. He moved quietly, tying his horse to a rock and moving closer on foot. The camp was small, a bedroll, a few supplies, and a fire barely clinging to life. Then he saw her. Evelyn Cross. She was sitting on a flat rock near the water, washing blood from her sleeve. Her hair was dark and tangled, her face marked with dust and exhaustion, but she was beautiful in a way that didn't belong to this world of guns and grit. Her eyes lifted suddenly, catching movement in the shadow. For a moment, neither moved. Colt stepped out slowly, his boots crunching softly on gravel. His voice came low and even, the kind of calm that made outlaws nervous before a gunfight. But he didn't speak. He just looked at her, this woman who was worth a fortune in gold and ruin in reputation. Her hand twitched toward the pistol at her hip, but she hesitated. A silence hung heavy between them, filled with wind and heartbeat and fate. He took a slow step forward, then another. Evelyn's breath came unevenly, her back against the canyon wall. She could run, but she didn't. She looked him in the eyes as if she already knew who he was. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with exhaustion more than fear. She asked if he'd come to kill her or bring her in. He said nothing, only met her stare until the quiet became unbearable. Then he nodded once, a small motion that meant everything. She stood slowly, her hand brushing the rock for balance. The chain around her wrist caught the light, a silver charm, old and worn. It didn't belong to a criminal, Colt thought. It belonged to someone who once believed in better days. He told her to pack her things. She didn't argue. She only turned to her horse and began to gather what little she had left. As they rode out under a blood-red sunset, the wind carried the faint sound of thunder in the distance. A storm was coming, one that neither of them could outrun. That night, they stopped by an old shack near the canyon rim. The roof sagged, the boards creaked, but it was shelter. Colt built a fire while Evelyn sat quietly by the door, her eyes fixed on the flames. For the first time, he noticed the cut on her arm was deeper than he'd thought. He handed her a strip of cloth from his saddlebag, and she looked at him, truly looked, as if seeing something unexpected in the man the world called heartless. She asked why he did it, why he hunted people for a living. He told her the truth. Because it paid, because it was clean, because the law didn't care how justice was done as long as it got done. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. He'd repeated that same line to himself for years, and suddenly, under the quiet hum of the desert night, it sounded false. Evelyn said she didn't kill anyone. She said the robbery had gone wrong, that someone else had fired the gun, that she'd run because no one would believe her. Colt had heard that story before, from men who lied to save their necks, from women who cried just long enough to reach for a hidden knife. But when she spoke, her voice carried something he couldn't place. Maybe it was the truth, or maybe it was hope pretending to be the truth. He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the fire until it was nothing but glowing embers and the sound of the wind outside. By morning, the storm had rolled in. Rain fell in hard, silver sheets, drumming against the roof like impatient hands. Colt saddled the horses while Evelyn stood near the doorway, watching the clouds crawl low across the sky. They rode through the downpour in silence, the trail turning slick beneath their boots. The world around them blurred, mud, mist, rain, and regret. Every mile drew them closer to Coyote's Ridge, and closer to a decision Colt wasn't sure he wanted to make. That night, as they made camp beneath a rocky outcrop, Evelyn spoke again, her words barely louder than the rain. She said she didn't expect mercy. She said she'd made her choices, and now she'd face them. But then she looked at him, and in her eyes, there was something that made his chest tighten. She said she didn't believe he was as cold as the story said. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Because she was right. That night, long after she fell asleep, Colt sat awake by the fire, staring into the rain. He took out the wanted poster, its ink running and edges soft from the wet. Her face stared back at him through the blurring lines, fading slowly until it was almost gone. He let it burn. By the time dawn touched the sky with pale gold, he knew he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The bounty hunter who'd never hesitated was hesitating now, not because of fear, but because of her. Because something about Evelyn Cross had reminded him of the man he used to be before the hunt had taken his soul. And somewhere deep down, he knew this wouldn't end clean. He knew love and the law couldn't ride the same trail forever. He just didn't know which one he'd choose when the time came. Rain had stopped by the time they reached the edge of Coyote's Ridge. The land spread wide and quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. The sun crept up over the mountains, casting a thin gold line across the wet earth, steam rising where it touched the ground. Colt Mercer rode slightly ahead, his hat pulled low, every muscle tight beneath his coat. Evelyn followed behind him, her horse limping slightly, its legs coated in mud. She looked worn, pale from the cold, but there was a quiet fire in her eyes that wouldn't die. They rode that way for hours, neither speaking. The trail turned narrow, hugging the river as it bent toward town. Colt could see the faint plume of smoke from chimneys in the distance, and something in his chest tightened. He'd been to Coyote's Ridge before. It was a place that smiled during the day and lay at night. A place that pretended to be peaceful, but every corner of it was owned by fear or money. He'd brought men there in irons, and the town always paid well for sin delivered. He told himself this would be no different. That when the time came, he'd hand Evelyn over, take the gold, and ride out before the sun set. But the truth settled like dust in the back of his throat. It didn't taste right anymore. By midday, they stopped near a ridge overlooking the valley. The view below looked almost peaceful, the wooden rooftops, the faint clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a wagon rolling down the main street. Evelyn sat in silence beside him, her gaze distant, as though remembering another life. He asked her what she planned to do once she was turned in. She didn't flinch at the question. She just said she hoped someone would listen before they hanged her. That maybe the truth would matter, even if it came too late. Colt didn't answer. He just watched the town, jaw tight, fingers drumming against the reins. The truth didn't matter much in Coyote's Ridge. Money did. The man who'd accused her, Jeb Rollins, was one of the richest cattle barons in the territory. His word would bury hers before the trial ever began. When they rode into town, heads turned. A bounty hunter was a familiar sight, but a woman in shackles behind him, that was talk worth having. Doors creaked open. Whispers followed them down the muddy street. Colt kept his eyes straight ahead until they reached the sheriff's office, a squat building with peeling paint and a warped sign swinging in the breeze. Sheriff Tanner stepped out, a broad man with a grizzled beard and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He looked at Colt first, then at Evelyn, and grinned like a man smelling profit. Colt dismounted, keeping his tone steady. He said he'd brought her in alive, just as ordered. Tanner chuckled, said alive was optional, but he appreciated the effort. He told Colt to wait while he fetched Rollins to confirm the bounty. Evelyn stood still beside her horse, her wrists bound, her face unreadable. When Tanner disappeared inside, Colt turned to her. He didn't know why he spoke, maybe to fill the silence, maybe because something inside him needed her to hear it. He said it'd be over soon. She nodded, her voice quiet as wind. She said she wasn't afraid to die. He wanted to believe her. Minutes later, Jeb Rollins came swaggering out from the saloon across the street, a glass of whiskey still in his hand. He was tall, broad, dressed in a clean vest and a smirk that didn't leave his face. He looked at Evelyn like she was property he'd lost and just recovered. He said she'd stolen from him, cost him good men, and he'd see her hang before sundown. Colt felt something cold stir in his stomach. There was something wrong in the way Rollins spoke. Too certain, too proud. The kind of man who built truth with gold, not proof. When Tanner handed Colt the bounty money, the coins clinked in his palm, heavy, bright, and hollow. Evelyn didn't look at him as they took her inside. She just walked past him quietly, eyes down, like she already knew this was how it would end. That night, Colt sat in the saloon, the money in a pouch on the table untouched. The place was loud with music and laughter, but none of it reached him. He'd done this dozens of times, brought in men and women who'd done worse, taken the pay, and ridden off without a second thought. But this one stayed with him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing there in the rain, her hair plastered to her face, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. When the bartender poured him another drink, Colt asked if Tanner still kept the cells downstairs. The man nodded, said there were only 2 and one was full. Colt sat there a long time, staring into his glass, the whiskey catching the lamplight like fire. Then he pushed it away, stood up, and walked out into the night. The rain had started again, soft this time, like the sky was whispering instead of weeping. He crossed the muddy street, boots sinking into the dirt, and slipped into the sheriff's office. Tanner was gone, probably sleeping off his drink. The keys hung on a nail near the desk. Colt's hand hovered over them, hesitating. He told himself he was just checking on her. Making sure she was alive, that was all. But deep down, he knew better. He took the keys, walked down the stairs, and stopped in front of the cell. Evelyn sat on the cot, her back straight, her hair loose around her shoulders. When she saw him, she didn't move, didn't speak. For a moment, they just stared at each other through the bars. Then Colt unlocked the door. The click of the key echoed like thunder in the quiet. Evelyn rose slowly, her voice barely a whisper when she asked why. He didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. He just said she didn't belong in this place. That something about her story didn't fit. She stepped closer, her face inches from his. Her eyes held fear and something else, hope, maybe, or disbelief. He told her to move fast. She didn't argue. They slipped out into the rain, silent shadows against the night. The horses waited behind the livery, restless, sensing what was coming. Colt helped her into the saddle, then swung onto his own. He looked back once at the town, the lights, the silence, the life he was about to lose, and then they rode. Through the mud, through the dark, through the kind of night that swallows sound and sin alike. They didn't stop until the ridge was far behind them, and the world was just wind and thunder again. Evelyn was shaking when they dismounted, her breath visible in the cold air. Colt built a fire, hands trembling more than they should have. He'd crossed every line that made him who he was, and yet, for the first time in years, he didn't feel dead inside. Evelyn looked at him across the flames, her eyes wet but strong. She said she didn't know why he'd done it, but she'd never forget it. He told her to rest. Tomorrow they'd need to ride farther, maybe out of the territory, maybe beyond the reach of the men who'd come for them. As she drifted to sleep, Colt sat alone, listening to the rain fade into mist. Somewhere out there, he knew Tanner would wake, find the cell empty, and raise hell. There'd be no forgiveness waiting, no pardon, no peace. But he didn't care. He'd spent years chasing ghosts for gold. Tonight, for once, he'd done something that felt like it mattered. He didn't know if it would save her or himself, but he knew this. He wasn't going back. Not to the law. Not to the lies. Not ever. The dawn broke slowly over the desert, a pale light crawling across the hills like it was afraid to touch them. Colt Mercer stood by the dying fire, hat in hand, watching the smoke rise and vanish into the morning chill. His coat was soaked from the night's rain, his boots caked in mud, but none of that mattered now. The law was on his heels, and somewhere behind that sunrise, Coyote's Ridge was waking to the sound of fury. He turned toward Evelyn. She was still asleep, wrapped in his old blanket, her head resting against the saddle. For a moment, she looked peaceful, almost like someone who belonged to another world, one without gunfire and betrayal. Colt didn't know what made him stay and look. Maybe it was guilt, maybe something deeper he didn't want to name. By the time she woke, he already had the horses ready. She rose slowly, blinking against the light, brushing the hair from her face. He handed her a piece of dry bread and some water. Neither spoke for a long while. The air between them was thick with what they both knew but wouldn't say. When they finally rode out, the desert was painted gold and quiet, but Colt's instincts screamed beneath that calm. Every sound, every bird call, every echo of hoofbeats set his nerves tight. He'd been a hunter too long not to know when he was being hunted. By noon, they reached an old riverbed that had long since run dry. The cracked ground stretched for miles, scattered with sagebrush and bones bleached white by sun and time. Evelyn's horse stumbled once, and Colt slowed to ride beside her. She asked him what would happen now. He told her the truth. They'd ride west toward the border, find the old mining road that cut through the mountain pass and disappear. Maybe into New Mexico, maybe farther. He didn't know what waited out there, only that it was better than what waited behind. Evelyn nodded, but her eyes held a question she didn't ask. After a long silence, she said she'd never meant for anyone to die back at Coyote's Ridge. She told him how Rollins had lied, how the robbery wasn't her idea, how the man who pulled the trigger had been one of Rollins' own, trying to silence a partner who'd threatened to talk. She said she ran because she saw the way Rollins smiled when he told the sheriff his story. Because she knew what kind of men they were and how little a woman's truth meant in a town like that. Colt listened, his face still, his jaw working slowly. He didn't say whether he believed her. But in the back of his mind, something shifted. He'd seen that smile on Rollins, too, the kind that belonged to men who built their power on fear. As the sun dipped lower, they stopped by a cluster of rocks that offered some shade. The horses drank from a shallow pool while Colt scouted the ridge with his spyglass. The horizon was empty, but dust trails could rise quickly out here, and he wasn't about to be surprised. Evelyn sat on a boulder, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small against the endless sky, but there was strength in the way she held herself, quiet, unbending. She asked him if he ever thought about leaving the life he lived, if bounty hunting ever stopped feeling like running from something. He said he didn't think about much besides the next job, the next paycheck. That was how you survived out here. She smiled faintly, said maybe surviving wasn't the same as living. Her words stuck with him longer than he wanted them to. When night fell, they built another fire, this one small and hidden among the rocks. The stars came out sharp and endless, the kind of sky that made a man feel both free and trapped all at once. Evelyn leaned against her saddle, watching the flames dance. Colt sat opposite her, the firelight catching in his eyes. She told him about the town she grew up in, how her father taught her to ride, how she used to race the boys down the trails by the river. She said she'd once believed the world had room for good people. Colt didn't tell her much about himself. Just that his father had been a soldier who never came back, and his mother died waiting for him. He'd learned early that the world took more than it gave, and you either hardened or you broke. The fire cracked softly between them. She said maybe he'd just forgotten how to live for something worth losing. He didn't answer, but she saw the way his eyes shifted, how they softened, if only for a moment. Then, far off, a sound cut through the stillness. Hoofbeats. Slow and steady. Colt was on his feet in an instant, dousing the fire with sand. He motioned for silence, drawing his revolver. They crouched behind the rocks, breath shallow, listening. 3 riders appeared in the distance, their shapes black against the moonlight. One of them carried a lantern. Colt cursed under his breath. Tanner had found their trail faster than he'd hoped. He told Evelyn they had to move, now. They mounted quickly, guiding the horses down the far slope, staying low in the shadows. The sound of pursuit grew faint, then closer again. Colt pushed harder, the wind whipping against his face, the pounding of hooves echoing like thunder across the canyon walls. They rode for miles, the desert stretching into silver-blue infinity. When they finally reached a narrow ravine, Colt turned the horses in, letting the darkness swallow them whole. They waited there, hearts hammering, listening as the riders thundered past above. When it was over, Evelyn slumped forward, trembling with relief. Colt dismounted, pacing slowly, his mind racing. He knew Tanner wouldn't quit. The man would keep coming until he had both their heads hanging from the sheriff's store. He walked to the edge of the ravine, looking up at the stars. He thought about the poster he'd burned, about how easy it would have been to let her hang and ride away rich. But now he was the one with a price on his head. Evelyn joined him, her voice low. She said she was sorry. He told her not to be. Those choices don't mean much until you've got something to lose. She looked at him for a long time, the firelight of the stars catching in her eyes. There was something there, something unspoken, fragile as glass. That night, they camped without a fire. The cold bit through their coats, but neither complained. They just sat close, sharing silence and warmth in the dark. For the first time, Colt didn't feel like the hunter or the hunted. He just felt human again. When morning came, they moved west toward the mountains. The land grew rougher, the air colder. Snow dusted the peaks ahead. It would be hard country, isolated, wild, but it might be safe. At midday, they stopped by a stream. Evelyn washed her hands, the water clear and cold. She said she'd never forget what he'd done for her, no matter how this ended. Colt wanted to tell her he didn't do it for her, that he did it because something inside him broke when he saw her in chains. But he didn't. He just said they'd make it through. And as they rode on, through wind and rock and the scent of rain on the horizon, he realized something terrible and true. He wasn't protecting her anymore. He was fighting for her. And that fight might cost him everything. The wind howled through the canyon that night, carrying dust and whispers of storm. The sky hung low and heavy, a bruised gray bleeding into black. Colt Mercer led the horses beneath a narrow overhang of rock, enough shelter to keep them dry, though not warm. The firelight from the small blaze flickered weakly against the canyon wall, painting their faces in trembling gold. Evelyn sat close, her knees drawn to her chest, shivering beneath the blanket Colt had wrapped around her. He sat across from her, sharpening his knife slowly, the steady scrape filling the silence. The air between them carried the weight of everything unspoken, gratitude, fear, and the quiet ache of 2 people who didn't belong anywhere anymore. Evelyn broke the silence first. She said she'd never seen a man throw his life away for someone he barely knew. Colt didn't look up. He said maybe it wasn't about knowing someone. Maybe it was about knowing yourself, what kind of man you really are when the world pushes you to choose. She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened in the light. She said he talked like a preacher who'd lost his church. He let out a quiet laugh, the first she'd ever heard from him. It was short and rough, but it carried warmth. He said maybe that was true. Maybe he'd been searching for something to believe in long before he found her in that canyon. They didn't say anything after that. They didn't have to. The wind said enough, carrying the smell of rain and dust through the night. Later, when the fire burned low, Evelyn dozed off, her head resting on her arm. Colt watched her for a long time. The way the shadows moved over her face, soft and strong all at once. The way her chest rose and fell with the slow rhythm of trust. He reached into his coat, pulling out a locket he'd carried for years, the only thing left from his mother. Inside was a faded picture, edges torn, the face of a woman who'd once told him kindness didn't make a man weak. He hadn't believed her then. Maybe he was starting to now. By dawn, the storm had broken. The sky was washed clean, and light spilled down over the mountains like forgiveness. They rode hard, higher into the pass, the ground turning rocky and narrow. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, but Colt didn't slow. He knew they had to stay ahead. Tanner wasn't a man to give up, and Rollins' money could buy a lot of persistence. By midday, they reached an old mining cabin perched on the edge of a ridge. It looked abandoned, a ghost of better times. The door hung crooked, and snow drifted through the gaps in the roof. Still, it was shelter. Colt dismounted, scanning the valley below. No movement. No dust trails. For now, they were safe. Inside, Evelyn lit a small fire while Colt dragged in wood and checked the windows. She watched him as he worked, the way he moved with quiet precision, the tension in every motion. He wasn't used to stillness. He wasn't used to caring. When he finally sat down beside her, the fire painted their faces in orange light. Evelyn's voice came soft, fragile like the first breath after crying. She said she didn't know what came next. He looked into the fire. He said he didn't either. That maybe for once, they could stop running, just for tonight. The room went quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was gentler, warmer. Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, hesitating before resting there. Colt didn't pull away. Her touch was light, but it carried more truth than 1,000 words. For the first time in years, he felt something break inside him, not the sharp kind of breaking that comes from loss, but the soft kind that makes room for something new. Outside, snow began to fall. Soft, steady, and soundless. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. The world beyond that cabin didn't exist for a while. Just the fire, the warmth, and the heartbeat of a man who'd spent his life alone finally finding something to live for. But peace is a rare thing in the West. It never lasts long. The next morning, Colt spotted movement on the horizon riders. 3, maybe 4. Tanner's men, closing in. He swore under his breath, packing their few things quickly. Evelyn saw the look on his face and didn't need to ask. She helped without a word. Within minutes, they were back in the saddle, galloping down the slope, snow spraying from beneath the horses' hooves. The chase was long and merciless. The air burned cold in their lungs. Gunshots cracked across the valley, echoing off stone. Colt turned in the saddle, firing once, twice, sending a rider spinning into the dust. Another came close enough that Colt could see his face, raw hatred under a wide-brimmed hat. He aimed again, but his gun jammed. Evelyn screamed his name, her horse veering left toward a narrow pass. Colt kicked hard, following her. The pursuers thundered after them, the sound of hooves like war drums. The pass ended at a river, swollen and fast from the melting snow. Colt looked back. The riders were less than 100 yards away. There was no choice. He told her to cross. She shook her head, saying they'd both drown. He told her again, louder this time. She met his eyes, and in that single look, she understood. He turned his horse, drawing his second revolver, and facing the men head-on. Bullets tore through the air, biting into the rock around him. He fired back, steady, controlled, buying her seconds, just seconds to live. Evelyn plunged into the river, the current dragging her down, her cry lost to the roar of water. Colt shot one rider off his horse, then another, until pain seared through his side. He looked down, blood spreading across his coat. Still, he kept firing. When the last gun clicked empty, the canyon fell silent again. The remaining rider fled, vanishing into the trees. Colt turned toward the river, chest heaving, vision blurring. He saw her, Evelyn, pulling herself to the far bank, soaked and gasping. He smiled faintly, even as his knees buckled. He pressed a hand to the wound, warm blood running through his fingers. The world tilted, spinning between shadow and light. He told himself he'd make it across. That he had to. But the ground came up fast, and the sound of the river grew distant, fading into the heartbeat in his ears. He fell hard, the cold earth catching him, the sky above burning gold. Somewhere beyond the rush of pain and fading light, he heard her voice calling his name. He wanted to answer. He wanted to tell her he was all right. But the dark came first. And the world went quiet. When Colt woke, the world was a blur of firelight and pain. The roof above him sagged low, the smell of smoke and rain mixing with blood. His vision sharpened slowly, shapes coming into focus, a flickering lantern, rough wooden beams, and Evelyn kneeling beside him, pressing a torn cloth to his wound. She was crying quietly, her hands trembling, her hair wet and tangled from the river. He tried to speak, but the sound that came out was little more than a rasp. She hushed him softly, saying he needed to save his strength. The room was small, maybe an old trapper's hut hidden deep in the valley. The fire in the corner crackled weakly, fighting the damp. Outside, wind pushed against the door, but they were safe for now. Colt's breath came slow and uneven. He asked her how long he'd been out. She said 2 days. He frowned, confused, trying to piece together what happened after he fell. She told him she found him by the riverbank, barely breathing, and dragged him here. Said she didn't know how, only that she wasn't about to let him die. He managed a weak smile. Told her she'd always been stubborn. She smiled too, though tears still shimmered in her eyes. She said maybe she learned that from him. Hours passed, marked by the sound of wind and rain against the roof. Evelyn changed the bandages, fed the fire, and sat close, her fingers tracing the back of his hand as if afraid he'd vanish if she let go. Colt drifted in and out of sleep, fever and memory tangled together. He dreamed of the town, of Rollins' cold smile, of Tanner's gun barrel gleaming in the sun. He dreamed of Evelyn running through dust and gunfire, and of his own voice calling her name through the smoke. When he woke again, dawn light filled the room, gray and soft, like the edge of forgiveness. Evelyn sat by the fire, dozing lightly. Her face looked peaceful for the first time in days. He watched her for a while, feeling something he couldn't name. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was both. By afternoon, he was strong enough to sit up. Evelyn helped him drink water, then broth she'd made from what little they had. He asked her what she planned to do next. Her voice shook when she said she didn't know. The law still thought she was guilty. Tanner's men could come back. There was nowhere to go. Colt said maybe there was. Maybe it was time to stop running. He told her about Rollins, about how the man had been using him and others for years, paying hunters to silence anyone who knew the truth about his land deals and smuggling. He said if they could reach the judge in Fort Mason, they could prove everything. Evelyn hesitated. The journey would be dangerous. But Colt's eyes burned with something she hadn't seen before, not anger, but purpose. And she realized then that he wasn't just trying to clear her name. He was trying to make peace with his own. So they rode. Colt's wound slowed them down, but he didn't complain. Each mile of dust and wind carried them closer to the truth. The landscape stretched endless around them, open plains, dry creek beds, lonely windmills spinning in the distance. The kind of land that tested a person's heart as much as their strength. Nights were cold, but Evelyn stayed close. Sometimes they didn't talk. Sometimes they did, about the lives they'd left behind, about the things they wished they could change. Colt told her about his mother, about how she died believing he'd become a good man. Evelyn told him about her father, a lawman himself, who taught her that justice wasn't always found in a badge. When they reached Fort Mason, the town was alive with movement, wagons, riders, merchants shouting across the square. Colt's body ached with every step, but he pushed on. They went straight to the courthouse, where Judge Mallory, an old man with silver hair and weary eyes, listened as Colt spoke. He laid everything bare: Rollins' schemes, the bounty orders, the false accusations against Evelyn. He handed over the documents he'd stolen from Rollins' office, evidence that tied him to every crime. Mallory sat silent for a long time after Colt finished. Then he nodded and said he'd seen too much of the West to be surprised, but not enough to stop hoping men like Colt still existed. Within days, Rollins was arrested. Tanner was caught trying to flee south. Evelyn's name was cleared. The bounty on her head was lifted. When it was over, the town gathered to watch Rollins led away in chains. Evelyn stood beside Colt, the wind tugging at her hair, the sun spilling gold across the street. She looked at him, the man who'd been sent to hunt her, who had instead chosen to save her. He said he didn't know what came next. Maybe a small ranch somewhere quiet. Maybe just peace. She smiled softly and said maybe peace was enough. They left Fort Mason before sunset, the road ahead open and endless. The sky burned orange, the kind of light that makes promises without words. As they rode side by side, Colt glanced at her and said he never thought he'd find something worth dying for. She said maybe that's how love always starts, by finding something worth living for instead. The trail stretched on, winding through the hills until the town disappeared behind them. The wind was warm now, carrying the scent of sage and sun. Colt reached out, his hand brushing hers as their horses moved in rhythm. Neither spoke. They didn't need to, because out there, beneath the wide western sky, silence said everything. And though the world had tried to break them both, they had found something unbreakable, not just in each other, but in the truth that love, once found, could never be outlawed. The sun sank low, turning the plains to gold, and they kept riding, two souls who had run from their pasts only to find their future together in the dust and the light of a dying day. Under that endless sky, love had been the only bounty that ever truly mattered.